If you're enjoying this video, smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell. Share it with your friends, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Every like and subscribe helps the channel grow. My name is Howard Tanner. I'm a park ranger in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, Tennessee. I've been here for almost 10 years now, living in a small cabin tucked away in the hollows. Most people think being a ranger is peaceful, but out here, surrounded by endless forests and icy trails, peace can feel a lot like loneliness. Maybe that's why I chose this life, to escape the noise in my head. I wasn't always like this. Before the war, I had a family, friends, and plans for the future. But after what I saw in Europe, the Battle of the Bulge and all those horrors, I came back a different man. Nightmares keep me awake most nights, and survivor's guilt follows me like a shadow. My wife left me 2 years ago because she couldn't handle my distance or the way I'd wake up screaming in the middle of the night. Now, it's just me and these mountains. It was February 1957, during one of the worst snowfalls this region had ever seen. The hollows were buried under thick layers of ice and snow, making everything look frozen in time. That morning, I was tracking some unusual animal migration patterns, deer moving lower into the valleys instead of staying up in the ridges where they usually roam during winter. As I followed their trail deeper into the forest, I stumbled upon something strange, a deer carcass half buried in snow with bite marks that didn't look like anything I'd seen before. The bites were jagged and deep, as though whatever had attacked it wasn't just hunting, it was tearing it apart out of rage or desperation. The snow around the body was stained red, but there was something odd about it. Some of the blood had frozen into unnatural shapes, almost like patterns or symbols. I took a step back, trying to make sense of it all, when Marcus Kelly, my junior ranger, radioed me from his patrol area nearby. "Howard," he said, his voice crackling through static, "you're not gonna believe this. We've got 3 college kids missing near Sugarland Mountain Trail." I sighed heavily and adjusted my scarf against the biting cold. Missing hikers weren't uncommon during winter storms, but something about this felt off, especially after seeing that deer carcass. "All right," I replied. "Meet me near the trailhead in an hour." When we reached their abandoned campsite later that afternoon, Marcus looked pale as he pointed at what we found. Tents ripped open as if something had clawed its way inside, and frozen blood splattered across the snow in strange patterns, similar to what I'd seen earlier with the deer carcass. Their boots were still there, neatly placed by one of the tents, but there were no signs of them anywhere nearby. Sheriff Elijah Dawson arrived shortly after we radioed him about the scene. He was a gruff man who didn't believe in anything he couldn't see with his own eyes. "Probably got lost," he muttered dismissively as he examined the area. "Happens every year, city kids thinking they can handle these mountains without proper gear." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something more sinister was at play here. As we searched further along their trail, I noticed boot prints that suddenly changed to hoof-like impressions mid-stride, as if whoever made them transformed halfway through walking. Trees nearby were marked with symbols that looked ancient and unfamiliar to me, yet eerily similar to markings I'd seen during my time in Europe near old battlefields. That evening, I decided to visit Grace Thornton, the only survivor of an attack 5 years ago that locals still whispered about but never fully believed. Grace lived alone now, far from town where people called her crazy behind her back. When she opened her door to me, her eyes were wide with fear even before I said anything. "You've seen it," she whispered, before I could speak. "Seen what?" I asked cautiously. "The thing that wears voices," she said quietly. "It called me with my boyfriend's voice, but it wasn't him." Her words sent a chill down my spine as she described how she barely escaped after hearing her boyfriend's voice calling her deeper into the woods one snowy night. But when she turned around to follow it, she saw something tall and skeletal standing among the trees instead. I left Grace's house feeling more unsettled than ever and returned to my cabin late that night. As I sat by my fireplace trying to warm up and clear my head, I heard something outside, a voice calling my name softly through the wind. "Howard." It was my ex-wife's voice, but she was hundreds of miles away in another state. I froze in place as chills ran down my spine, not from the cold outside, but from fear deep inside me. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? The voice outside my cabin sounded exactly like my ex-wife, but I knew it couldn't be her. She was nowhere near these mountains. I stayed by the fire, gripping my old M1911 pistol, the one I'd kept from the war. Regulations said I wasn't supposed to have it, but out here, rules felt more like suggestions. By morning, Marcus radioed me again. His voice sounded nervous. "Howard, we found something strange near the search area." I met him at the trailhead with 2 deputies Sheriff Dawson had sent to help us. Marcus led us deeper into the woods until we reached an old mining cabin that hadn't been used in decades. The place looked like it was holding secrets: rotting wood, broken windows, and snow piled high against the walls. "Kelly," I said, using his last name as I always did, "what did you find?" He pointed to the ground near the cabin's entrance. There was a ranger hat lying there, covered in frost. It was Kelly's hat, the one he'd been wearing yesterday. But Kelly wasn't there. The deputies exchanged uneasy glances as we stepped inside the cabin to look for him. The air inside felt colder than outside, which didn't make sense. My breath froze mid-air as I exhaled, hanging like smoke in front of me. On the walls were primitive drawings scratched into the wood, figures with elongated limbs and antlers hunting humans. "What is this?" one of the deputies asked, his voice shaking slightly. I didn't answer because I didn't know. All I knew was that something about this place felt wrong, like we weren't supposed to be here. As night fell faster than expected, we decided to stay in the cabin until morning, when visibility would be better for searching. One of the deputies pulled out a small camping stove to heat some soup, while Marcus sat quietly in a corner, staring at those drawings on the wall. "I don't think we're alone out here," Marcus finally said, breaking the silence. "What do you mean?" I asked. He hesitated before answering. "I've been hearing voices calling my name, like someone's out there." I didn't tell him about what I'd heard outside my cabin last night because I didn't want to scare him any more than he already was. Later that night, one of the deputies started acting strange. He kept complaining about being hungry, even though he'd just eaten a full meal not an hour ago. His hands shook as he rummaged through his pack for more food. "You're fine," Marcus said nervously. "You just ate." "No," the deputy snapped back, his voice sharp and desperate. "I'm starving." Before anyone could stop him, he grabbed his coat and stormed outside into the freezing darkness. "Wait," Marcus shouted after him, but it was too late. The deputy disappeared into the woods without another word. We waited hours for him to come back, but he never did. The temperature inside the cabin dropped even further as midnight approached. It felt like something was pressing down on us, something heavy and suffocating that made it hard to breathe. Then we heard it, Kelly's voice calling for help from outside. "Howard, Marcus, help me." It sounded like he was close, maybe just beyond the tree line, but something about it felt off, too perfect, too rehearsed. Marcus jumped up and grabbed his flashlight. "It's Kelly. He's alive. Stop." I barked at him before he could open the door. "That's not Kelly." Marcus froze in place, looking at me like I'd lost my mind. "How do you know?" he asked. "Because whatever's out there doesn't leave tracks," I said quietly. Marcus shined his flashlight through one of the broken windows toward where we thought Kelly's voice was coming from, but there were no footprints in the snow. Nothing at all. We stayed inside after that, huddled near what little warmth our fire provided as strange noises echoed through the woods, cracking ice, snapping branches, and whispers that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Alleged. When dawn finally broke, we stepped outside cautiously to look for signs of our missing deputy and Kelly, but all we found was frost-covered ground and silence. Then Marcus pointed toward a tree near the edge of the clearing. Carved into its bark were more symbols, the same ones from inside the cabin, and beneath them lay our missing deputy's frozen body, posed like he was hunting something invisible in front of him. His eyes were gone, and so was his tongue. The sight of the deputy's body froze us in place. His face looked like it had been carved out of ice, his mouth open in a scream that would never come. Marcus stepped back, his hand shaking as he pointed at the symbols on the tree. What does that mean?" he stammered. I didn't answer right away. I couldn't. My mind was racing, trying to piece together what was happening. Those symbols, they weren't just random scratches. They meant something. I'd seen similar markings before, in Europe, etched into walls by survivors who believed they offered protection. But protection from what? We need to leave, I said finally, my voice firm but low. Now. Marcus nodded quickly, but before we could move, the air around us seemed to shift. It wasn't just cold anymore, it was unnatural. The kind of cold that crawls under your skin and makes your bones ache. Then we heard it again, Kelly's voice. Howard, Marcus, help me. This time it was closer, too close. The words echoed from all directions, bouncing off the trees like they were mocking us. That's not Kelly, I yelled over the sound, grabbing Marcus by the arm before he could run toward the voice. It's trying to lure us. Marcus looked at me with wide, terrified eyes. What is it? I didn't have an answer for him. Not yet. We started moving back toward the cabin, but the woods felt different now, like they were alive and watching us. Every snap of a branch or crunch of snow made my heart race. I kept my pistol drawn, even though deep down I knew it wouldn't do much good against whatever was out there. When we reached the cabin, the door was wide open even though we'd shut it before leaving. Inside, the fire had gone out completely, and the room felt colder than ever. The drawings on the walls seemed darker somehow, like they'd been burned into the wood instead of scratched. Then Marcus gasped and pointed at the floor near the fireplace. There were fresh symbols carved into the wooden planks, symbols that hadn't been there when we left. What's happening? Marcus whispered, his voice trembling. It's playing with us, I said quietly, trying to keep calm for his sake. It wants us scared. Wants us scared. Just as I said those words, something slammed against the roof of the cabin, a loud thud that shook dust loose from the rafter. Marcus jumped back, his flashlight shaking in his hand as he aimed it upward. Howard, he whispered. Barely able to speak, I motioned for him to stay quiet as I stepped toward one of the broken windows to look outside. The snow reflected pale light from the cloudy sky, but there was something moving out there, something tall and thin with limbs that didn't bend like they should. It stopped suddenly and turned toward me. Even from a distance, I could see its face, or what was left of it. It looked like a skull stretched over skin too tight to hold it together. Antlers jutted out from its head like twisted branches, and then it spoke, not with one voice but many layered together, each one overlapping and echoing in my mind. Howard Tanner. It knew my name. I stumbled back from the window as Marcus grabbed my arm again. What is that? He shouted. It's a Wendigo, I said without thinking, the words slipping out before I could stop myself. A what? Marcus asked, his voice rising in panic. I didn't have time to explain, because whatever was on our roof started moving again, fast and loud, like breaking ice, and then everything went silent. The silence was worse than the noise, because it meant we couldn't tell where it was anymore. Suddenly, Marcus screamed as something crashed through one of the windows behind him, a long arm with clawed fingers reaching inside for him. I grabbed him and pulled him away just as glass shattered across the floor. Get behind me, I yelled as I raised my pistol and fired at the creature's arm. The bullet passed straight through it like smoke, leaving nothing but a faint shimmer where flesh should have been. The creature pulled back and disappeared into the darkness outside, but we could still hear it circling us, its footsteps silent despite moving through thick snow. We can't stay here, Marcus shouted over his shoulder as he grabbed his pack and headed for the door. No, I yelled after him. It's safer inside. But Marcus didn't listen. Fear had taken over completely, and he ran out into the woods before I could stop him. I stood frozen for a moment before grabbing my pack and following him outside into the cold night air. The wind whipped around me as snow fell harder than before, making it almost impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Marcus, I shouted into the darkness, but there was no answer, only whispers that sounded like his voice calling back to me from somewhere deep in the trees. And then I saw him, or what was left of him. Marcus stood near a clearing ahead of me, his body twisted unnaturally as his arms stretched longer than humanly possible. His face looked hollowed out like something had drained all life from him, leaving only skin and bone behind. He turned slowly toward me with empty eyes and spoke in that same layered voice. Howard Tanner. I raised my pistol again, even though I knew it wouldn't help, and then everything went black as something hit me hard from behind. When I came to, I was lying face down in the snow. My head throbbed, and my body felt like it had been run over by a truck. The cold bit into my skin, but it was the silence that scared me the most. No wind, no whispers, no footsteps, just an eerie stillness that made my chest tighten. I pushed myself up, groaning as pain shot through my back. My pistol was still in its holster, but my flashlight was gone. I looked around, squinting in the dim light of the snow-covered forest. The cabin was nowhere in sight. Marcus. I called out weakly, though I already knew he wouldn't answer. My breath came out in ragged clouds as I tried to get my bearings. The trees around me looked unfamiliar, their branches heavy with snow and ice. It was like the forest had shifted while I was unconscious, twisting itself into something unrecognizable. And then I saw them, symbols carved into the bark of a tree just ahead of me. The same symbols from the cabin and the deputy's body. They seemed to glow faintly in the pale light, almost as if they were alive. I didn't know why, but something about those symbols gave me hope. Maybe it was instinct or desperation, but I felt like they could protect me. I pulled out my knife and started carving one of the symbols into a nearby tree, copying it as best as I could from memory. My hands were shaking so badly from the cold and fear that it took longer than it should have. But when I finished, I felt a strange sense of relief, like I'd built a small barrier between myself and whatever was out there. That relief didn't last long. A sound broke through the silence, a low creak, like ice cracking under pressure. It came from behind me. Slowly I turned around. It was there. The Wendigo stood just a few yards away, its skeletal frame towering over me like a nightmare come to life. Its antlers seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky, and its hollow eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my stomach churn. It didn't move at first, just stared at me with that awful face. Then it spoke again, its voice layered with whispers and screams. Howard Tanner, you cannot run. I stumbled back against the tree, gripping my pistol even though I knew it wouldn't do any good. My mind raced as I tried to think of something, anything that could save me. Then I remembered the mining cabin. The old records we'd found there mentioned workers disappearing after hearing voices calling them into the mines. If there were tools or equipment left behind in that cabin, maybe I could use them to fight back. I didn't have another option. I bolted through the trees, ignoring the pain in my legs and lungs as I ran blindly toward where I thought the cabin might be. The Wendigo let out a bone-chilling screech behind me, a sound like ice shattering mixed with an animal's roar, and I knew it was coming after me. The forest seemed endless as branches clawed at my face and snow clung to my boots, slowing me down with every step. But then, through the haze of panic and exhaustion, I saw it, the outline of the mining cabin up ahead. I burst through the door and slammed it shut behind me, leaning against it as my chest heaved with each breath. The air inside was just as cold as outside, but at least there were walls between me and that thing for now. I searched the room frantically for anything that could help me fight back. My eyes landed on an old oil can sitting on a shelf near some rusted tools. An idea sparked in my mind, a desperate one, but it was all I had. I grabbed the oil can and started pouring its contents over anything flammable in the room. Wooden beams, broken furniture, even scraps of paper left behind by miners decades ago. Then I found an old lantern and prayed it still worked as I struck a match to light it. The flame caught instantly, spreading quickly across the room as smoke filled the air. The heat was overwhelming after hours in the freezing cold, but I didn't care. I needed this fire to keep that thing away. The Wendigo's screech echoed outside again, louder this time as it closed in on the cabin. Through one of the broken windows, I saw its shadow moving closer, its elongated limbs stretching unnaturally as it crawled toward me like some kind of grotesque spider. It stopped just outside the cabin and stared at me through the flames with those hollow eyes. For a moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, the fire would keep it at bay. But then, it spoke again. "You cannot kill me," it said in that awful layered voice. "You are mine, The flames roared higher, as if mocking its words, but then something unexpected happened. Kelly's voice broke through all those layers. The real Kelly's voice. "Howard, help me." For a split second, I saw him, Marcus Kelly, trapped inside that monstrous form like he was fighting to take control again. His eyes flickered with recognition before they went dark once more. I knew what had to be done. With shaking hands, I grabbed an old pickaxe from one corner of the room and stepped toward the flames where the Wendigo stood waiting outside. It lunged at me through one of the windows just as I swung with everything I had left in me. The pickaxe hit its mark right between those hollow eyes, and for a moment time seemed to stop as both Kelly's voice and the Wendigo's screech filled my ears at once. Then everything went black again. When I woke up, I was lying in the snow again. My body felt like it had been frozen solid and my head was pounding. For a moment, I thought I might still be in the cabin, but when I opened my eyes, I saw nothing but endless white all around me. I had no idea how I got there. The last thing I remembered was swinging the pickaxe at the Wendigo, hearing Kelly's voice, and then nothing. I pushed myself up slowly, every muscle in my body screaming in protest. My fingers were numb, and when I looked down at my hand, I realized 2 of them were gone, severed cleanly at the knuckle. The sight made my stomach turn, but there was no time to dwell on it. I wasn't alone. The forest was silent, but I could feel something watching me. My breath came out in short, panicked bursts as I scanned the trees for any sign of movement. The symbols I'd carved into the tree earlier were nowhere to be seen, and the mining cabin was gone too, like it had never existed. I stumbled forward, trying to find my way back to civilization. Every step felt heavier than the last as exhaustion and cold dragged me down. My mind raced with questions. Was the Wendigo dead? Was Kelly still trapped inside it? And how had I ended up here? After what felt like hours of wandering, I finally saw a faint light in the distance. It flickered like a lantern, and for a brief moment, hope surged through me. But as I got closer, that hope turned to dread. The light wasn't coming from a rescue team or a ranger station, it was coming from another set of symbols carved into a tree. They glowed faintly in the dim light of dawn, just like the ones near the cabin. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. The symbols weren't a sign of safety, they were a warning. The Wendigo wasn't gone, it was still out there. Somehow, I managed to make it back to the ranger station later that day, though I don't remember much about how I got there. Search and rescue teams found me half frozen and delirious in a snowdrift miles from where we'd been searching for Kelly and the missing hikers. They said I was lucky to be alive, but they didn't believe me. When I told them about what happened, the voices, the symbols, the Wendigo, they chalked it up to hypothermia and trauma. The official report said the missing hikers were likely killed by wildlife or lost in the storm. Marcus Kelly was listed as presumed dead, and the deputies who'd come with us were written off as victims of exposure. No one wanted to hear about ancient spirits or monsters that wore human voices. Dr. Walter Pierce came to visit me while I was recovering in the hospital. He didn't say much at first, just sat by my bed with a stack of old books and papers he'd brought with him. "I believe you," he said finally, breaking the silence. I stared at him, not sure if he was serious or just humoring me. "My grandfather encountered something similar back in 1887, he continued. He called it the winter cannibal, said it came every 70 years like clockwork. He handed me one of his books, a journal written by his grandfather detailing strange disappearances and sightings of a creature that sounded exactly like what we'd faced in those woods. "It's not over," Dr. Pierce said quietly. "It never is." His words stayed with me long after he left. Weeks later, when I returned to work, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The hollows felt different now, darker somehow, even during daylight hours. Rangers found the burned remains of what they assumed was an old hunting cabin deep in the forest, but there were no bodies inside, no evidence of what had happened there. And then there were my dreams, or maybe they weren't dreams at all. Every night since that encounter, I've heard voices calling my name, familiar voices that shouldn't be anywhere near these mountains. Sometimes it's Kelly's voice, sometimes it's Marcus, sometimes it's Grace Thornton, or even my ex-wife. But worst of all, sometimes it's my own voice calling back to me from somewhere deep in those woods. One night, while sitting alone in my cabin, staring into the fire like I always do now, something caught my eye, a reflection in the window across from me. For just a moment, barely long enough to register, I saw something staring back at me that wasn't quite human. Elongated limbs, hollow eyes, antlers growing from its head. When I blinked, it was gone, but deep down I knew what it meant. The Wendigo had marked me somehow, left its shadow behind inside of me, and no matter how far I ran or how hard I fought, it would always find its way back. The cycle would repeat again someday, maybe not for another 70 years, but when it did, someone else would have to face it, and maybe next time they wouldn't survive. My name is Evelyn Patterson, and I've spent the last 15 years working as a park ranger in the Pacific Northwest. It's not an easy job, especially being the first woman to hold the senior ranger position around here. People are always waiting for me to mess up, but I've learned to keep my head down and focus on the work. The forest doesn't judge me, and neither does the water. At least that's what I thought. It was the summer of 1968, and something about that season felt off. The air was warmer than usual, sticky and heavy like it was holding its breath. The lake I was assigned to, Claw Lake, was lower than I'd ever seen it. The shoreline had pulled back, exposing caves that had been hidden underwater for who knows how long. It should have been exciting, a chance to explore something new, but instead it felt wrong, like we weren't supposed to see what was beneath. I was out on the boat early one morning, supervising routine water tests with Mike Daniels, my deputy ranger. Mike wasn't exactly the most reliable guy. He drank too much and carried a lot of baggage from his time in Vietnam, but he had a good heart. We were testing water quality when our equipment suddenly shorted out. No warning, no explanation, it just stopped working. "Must be a bad battery," Mike muttered, shaking the device like that would fix it. I frowned and looked out over the lake. The water was so still it looked like glass, reflecting the dense old-growth forest surrounding us. But something about it made my skin crawl. "It's not the battery," I said quietly. "There's something interfering." Mike gave me a look like I was crazy, but before he could say anything, we heard shouting from the shore. 3 teenagers had gone missing overnight. Campers who'd been swimming in the lake after dark. Their tents were torn apart, their sleeping bags shredded like something had clawed through them. We organized a search party immediately. The sheriff showed up with his deputies, stomping around like he owned the place. Sheriff Grant didn't like me or my team. He thought federal park rangers were stepping on his turf. "Probably just ran off," he said dismissively when I explained the situation. But when we found strange circular depressions along the shoreline, like something massive had been dragging itself through the mud, even he couldn't ignore it. The next few days were a blur of strange events. A local fishing guide reported catching deformed fish with bite marks that didn't match any known predator. The Wright twins, Jacob and Joseph, found massive scales washed ashore that shimmered in the sunlight like they belonged to something out of a nightmare. Then there were the storms. Electrical storms rolled in without warning, crackling through clear skies like nature itself was angry. One of our search dogs refused to go near the water. It growled and barked every time we tried to lead it closer. Dr. Sylvia Monroe arrived to study the lake's ecology shortly after that. She was brilliant but blunt, more interested in her research than making friends. Her underwater equipment captured sonar images of something moving deep below the surface, something impossibly large. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched every time I went near the lake. Mike started acting strange too, spending hours staring at the water like it was calling to him. And then came the stories. The Wright twins told me about their tribe's ancestral legends, a water demon that lived in Claw Lake for centuries, only waking every 50 years when its nest was disturbed. They said their people avoided swimming in the lake for generations because they knew what lurked beneath. I wanted to dismiss it as superstition, but deep down I knew better. One night during patrol, I saw Mike standing at the edge of the water under an electrical storm that lit up the sky like fireworks. He wasn't moving, just staring into the lake with this blank expression on his face. "Mike," I called out, running toward him. He didn't respond, and then he started walking into the water. I froze for a second when I saw Mike stepping into the lake. The water was pitch black under the stormy sky, and the way he moved, it wasn't normal. It was slow, deliberate, like he wasn't in control of his own body. "Mike," I shouted again, my voice shaking. I ran toward him as fast as I could, splashing into the water up to my knees. The cold hit me like a slap, but I didn't care. I grabbed his arm and tried to pull him back. "What are you doing? Snap out of it." He turned his head toward me, and for a moment I thought he'd come to his senses. But when I looked into his eyes, they were blank, empty, like he wasn't really there. Before I could say anything else, something moved in the water behind him. It was quick, just a ripple that broke the surface, but it was enough to make my stomach drop. Mike suddenly collapsed into my arms, like whatever had been controlling him let go all at once. I dragged him back to shore, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. He was breathing, but completely out of it, mumbling something I couldn't understand. I called for help on the radio, but the storm had knocked out the signal. The Wright twins arrived a few minutes later. They'd been patrolling nearby and heard me yelling. Together, we carried Mike back to the ranger station. "What happened?" Joseph asked, as we laid Mike down on a cot. "I don't know," I admitted, shaking my head. "He just walked into the lake like he couldn't stop himself." Jacob frowned and glanced at his brother. "It's starting," he said quietly. "What's starting?" I demanded. "The stories," Jacob replied. "Our ancestors warned us about this. When people start acting strange around the lake, it means the demon is awake." I wanted to argue with them, to tell them it was just superstition, but the truth was, I didn't have an explanation for what had happened to Mike. And deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that they might be right. The next day, Dr. Monroe showed me something that made my skin crawl. She'd been analyzing water samples from Claw Lake and found compounds she couldn't identify, something that seemed to affect neural pathways in living organisms. "It's almost like a parasite," she explained, her voice calm but serious. "If these compounds are in high enough concentrations, they could alter brain chemistry." "Are you saying this could explain what happened to Mike?" I asked. She nodded slowly. It's possible, but that wasn't all she'd found. Her underwater research equipment had captured more sonar images, this time clearer than before. The object moving beneath the surface wasn't just large, it was massive, over 40 feet long, with a serpentine shape that sent chills down my spine. Later that afternoon, Jacob and Joseph discovered something even more disturbing while exploring one of the newly exposed caves along the shoreline. Ancient petroglyphs carved into the walls. The symbols depicted a creature, a serpent-like figure surrounded by human figures bowing before it, and warnings written in their tribal language about a water spirit that demanded respect or revenge. "This isn't just a legend," Jacob said firmly as we studied the carvings by flashlight. "Our people knew this thing was real." I didn't want to believe him, but everything was pointing in one direction. Something unnatural was living in Claw Lake. That night, I stayed up late going through old records about the area's history. What I found made my blood run cold. Reports of disappearances around Claw Lake every 50 years, 1918, 1868. All eerily similar to what was happening now. I couldn't sleep after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mike walking into the water or those sonar images of something huge moving beneath the surface. The next morning during patrol, Joseph came running toward me with panic written all over his face. "It's happening again," he said breathlessly. "What is?" I asked. "It's Mike," Joseph replied. "He's gone." I felt my stomach drop when Joseph told me Mike was gone. "What do you mean, gone?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "He left the station last night," Joseph said. "I thought he was just going for air, but when I checked this morning, his cot was empty. No one's seen him since." I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my gear and headed straight for the lake, with Joseph and Jacob close behind. The shoreline was eerily quiet, the water so still it looked unnatural. We searched everywhere, calling out Mike's name, checking the caves along the edge, but there was no sign of him. And then we found his flashlight. It was half buried in the mud near one of the exposed caves, its beam still faintly glowing. My chest tightened as I picked it up and looked around. "Mike," I shouted again, my voice echoing off the rock walls. Joseph stepped closer to the cave entrance and froze. "Evelyn," he said quietly, his voice trembling, "you need to see this." I followed his gaze and felt my breath catch in my throat. Inside the cave, the walls were covered in something that looked like preserved human remains, bones and skin fused into the rock as if they'd been there for centuries. The faces were twisted in expressions of fear, their mouths open in silent screams. Jacob stepped back, shaking his head. "This isn't right," he muttered. "We shouldn't be here." I couldn't argue with him. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to leave, but I couldn't ignore what we'd found. Something had dragged Mike into this cave, or worse. We returned to the station just as Sheriff Grant arrived with 2 of his deputies. He wasn't happy about what we'd discovered. "You're letting old stories scare you," he said dismissively when I explained everything. "It's not just stories," I argued, showing him the sonar images and water samples Dr. Monroe had collected. "Something is living in that lake, something dangerous." Grant shook his head and turned to his deputies. "We're dragging the lake," he announced. I tried to stop him, but he wouldn't listen. He loaded his men onto a boat and headed out into the water with heavy equipment, meant to dredge up whatever was hiding beneath the surface. I stayed on shore with Jacob and Joseph, watching nervously as they worked. The boat moved slowly across the lake, its engine rumbling loudly in the quiet air, and then everything went wrong. The water erupted beneath them like a bomb had gone off, flipping the boat over in an instant. The deputies screamed as they were thrown into the lake, but their voices were cut off almost immediately. Grant managed to grab onto a piece of debris and started swimming toward shore, but before he could reach us, something pulled him under. It happened so fast I barely had time to react. One moment he was there, gasping for air, and the next he was gone. Jacob grabbed my arm as we stood frozen on the shore. "We need to leave," he said urgently, but I couldn't move. My mind was racing with questions. What was this thing? Why now? And how could we stop it? Dr. Monroe arrived later that evening with more disturbing news. She'd been analyzing samples from deeper parts of the lake and found evidence of parasitic organisms that seemed to be spreading rapidly through the water, organisms that could explain why people were acting strange and why fish were dying from electrical burns. "It's adapting," she said grimly. "Whatever this thing is, it's changing." That night, I had vivid dreams of swimming freely in impossibly deep water, dreams so real I woke up gasping for air as if I'd been holding my breath underwater. And then Joseph came running into my cabin with panic written all over his face. "Jacob's gone," he said breathlessly. When Joseph told me Jacob was gone, I felt my chest tighten. Not again. I grabbed my boots and flashlight, barely stopping to grab my gear before rushing out the door. Joseph followed close behind, his face pale and full of fear. "Where did he go?" I asked, my voice sharp with urgency. "He said he wanted to check the caves again," Joseph replied, struggling to keep up. "He thought there might be something we missed." The shoreline was quiet when we arrived. Too quiet. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on us, and the water glowed faintly under the moonlight. It wasn't natural. It wasn't right. We found Jacob's gear near the cave entrance, his diving mask and oxygen tank left in a neat pile as if he'd planned to come back. But he wasn't there. I turned to Joseph, who was shaking his head in disbelief. "He wouldn't just leave his equipment," he said. "Something's wrong." I nodded, swallowing hard as I stared into the dark opening of the cave. "Stay here," I told him firmly. "If anything happens, call for help." Joseph hesitated but eventually nodded. I strapped on Jacob's abandoned oxygen tank and mask, then stepped into the water. It was colder than I expected, sending a shiver down my spine as I waded deeper into the cave. The walls were slick with algae and strange markings, patterns that looked almost geometric, like they'd been carved intentionally. My flashlight flickered as I moved deeper into the tunnel, its beam barely cutting through the murky water, and then I saw it. The nest. It was massive, a cavern filled with pulsating eggs that glowed faintly in the dark. They were clustered together like a hive, each one shimmering with bioluminescent patterns that shifted and pulsed in time with my heartbeat. I froze, unable to look away. This was it, the source of everything happening in Claw Lake. The creature wasn't just living here, it was breeding. And then I saw Jacob. He was alive, or at least he looked alive, but something was wrong. He was floating near the eggs, his body limp, but his eyes wide open, staring blankly ahead like he wasn't really there. His skin had taken on an unnatural sheen, almost like it was changing to match the water around him. "Jacob." I shouted through my mask, but he didn't respond. Before I could move closer, something shifted behind me, a massive shadow that blocked out what little light remained. My heart stopped as I turned slowly and came face to face with the creature. It was bigger than I'd imagined, its serpentine body stretching far beyond what my flashlight could illuminate. Its scales shimmered like liquid metal, blending perfectly with the water around it. And its eyes were intelligent, almost human in their intensity. For a moment neither of us moved. Then it let out a low-frequency sound that vibrated through my entire body, a sound so deep I felt it more than heard it. My thoughts became fuzzy, and I realized too late that it wasn't just a sound, it was something more. It was trying to control me. I fought back as hard as I could, focusing on Jacob's face to ground myself. "You're not taking me," I whispered through gritted teeth. The creature moved closer, its bioluminescent patterns pulsing faster as it studied me. And then, something clicked in my mind, a memory from years ago that I'd buried deep inside. The scar on my shoulder. I'd gotten it when I was a child swimming in Claw Lake, a sharp pain beneath the water that left me bleeding and terrified but unable to explain what had happened. Now I knew this wasn't my first encounter with the creature. It had been watching me all along. I reached for the dynamite we'd found near an old mining site earlier that week, the only weapon we had left, and set the timer with shaking hands. "I'm sorry," I whispered to Jacob before swimming toward the eggs. The creature lunged at me as soon as it realized what I was doing, its massive body twisting through the water like a living nightmare. But I didn't stop. I planted the dynamite near the nest and swam as fast as I could toward an air pocket near the cave entrance. The explosion rocked the entire cavern, sending debris and water crashing around me. The creature let out a deafening roar, a sound so full of rage and pain that it made my ears ring even underwater. I barely made it out alive. I burst out of the water, gasping for air as the explosion echoed behind me. The surface of the lake rippled violently, and chunks of debris from the caves floated to the top. My lungs burned, my arms ached, but I didn't stop swimming until I reached the shore. Joseph was waiting for me, his face pale and filled with panic. "Evelyn, what happened? Where's Jacob?" I collapsed onto the muddy ground, coughing and shaking. He's still in there," I managed to say between breaths. "The creature, it's protecting its nest." Joseph's face crumpled with grief, but before he could respond, the water behind us began to churn. A low, rumbling sound filled the air, a sound that made my skin crawl. The creature wasn't dead, it was angry. "Run," I shouted, grabbing Joseph's arm and pulling him toward the ranger station. We sprinted through the forest, branches whipping at our faces as the sound of crashing water grew louder behind us. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel it. Feel something, moving through the lake, heading for shore. When we reached the station, Dr. Monroe was already there, frantically packing up her equipment. "What's going on?" she demanded when she saw us. "It's coming," I said breathlessly. "The creature, it's not going to stop." Dr. Monroe's face went pale, but she nodded quickly and grabbed her notes. "We need to get out of here," she said. But before we could move, the ground beneath us trembled. The creature had reached land. I grabbed a flare gun from the supply cabinet and loaded it with shaking hands. It wasn't much, but it was all we had left. "Get to the truck," I told Joseph and Dr. Monroe. "I'll hold it off." "No way," Joseph protested. "I'm not leaving you. You don't have a choice," I snapped. "Go." Reluctantly, Joseph and Dr. Monroe ran for the truck while I stepped outside, holding the flare gun tightly. The forest was eerily silent except for the faint sound of water dripping from the trees, and then it appeared. The creature dragged itself onto shore with a terrifying grace, its massive body glistening in the moonlight. Its bioluminescent patterns pulsed faster now, casting an eerie glow across the clearing. It let out another low-frequency sound that rattled my bones and made my thoughts blur. But this time, I fought back. I raised the flare gun and fired straight at its head. The flare hit its mark, exploding in a burst of light and heat that made the creature recoil with a deafening roar. "Come on," I shouted at it, backing toward the truck as I reloaded. "You want me? Come get me." The creature lunged forward, its serpentine body twisting through the trees like a living nightmare. But before it could reach me, Joseph slammed on the truck's horn, distracting it just long enough for me to climb into the passenger seat. "Drive," I yelled. Joseph didn't need to be told twice. He floored it and we sped down the dirt road as fast as we could go. The creature chased us for a while, its glowing form visible in the rearview mirror, but eventually it stopped and disappeared back into the forest. We didn't stop driving until we were miles away from Claw Lake. In the days that followed, officials closed off access to Claw Lake entirely, citing safety concerns after what they called a landslide, but I knew better. The explosion had collapsed part of the cave system and drained some of the water into underground channels, but it hadn't killed the creature. Dr. Monroe left shortly after that, taking her research with her. She promised to keep in touch, but warned me not to share what we'd seen with anyone else. "People won't believe you," she said simply. Joseph stayed for a while to help me clean up what was left of our station, but eventually he left too, unable to shake what had happened to his brother. As for me, I stayed behind. Someone had to keep watch over Claw Lake to make sure no one else disturbed what was still lurking beneath its surface. But even now, years later, I can't shake this feeling it's not over. Because sometimes at night when everything is quiet, I swear I can still hear that low-frequency hum vibrating through the air. And I know it's still out there waiting. My name is Robert Jenkins, but everyone calls me Bobby. I'm a park ranger, have been for over 25 years now. The forest is my home, my sanctuary. It's where I found peace after Vietnam, where I built my cabin, and where I feel closest to my roots. My father was a ranger before me, and his father before him. This land runs through my veins like the rivers that used to flow here before the drought came. It was the summer of 1976. Hotter than I'd ever seen it. The trees were thirsty, the ground cracked, and the animals restless. But there was one part of the forest that didn't seem to care about the drought. A grove deep in Redwood National Park. It was lush, green, and alive in a way that felt unnatural. That's where all this started. I was out on patrol when I first noticed something strange. The trees in that grove weren't just growing. They were arranged in patterns, perfect circles, triangles, even spirals. It didn't make sense. Trees don't grow like that on their own. I stood there staring at them for what felt like hours, trying to figure it out. The air was heavy, like it was holding its breath, and the shadows didn't fall right. Even though it was midday, they stretched long and twisted across the ground. I radioed Thomas Whitaker, my partner and closest friend on the ranger team. "Tommy," I said, "you need to see this." He showed up with his camera slung around his neck like always. Tommy's an environmentalist at heart. Used to be one of those activists chaining himself to trees before he joined the Rangers. He started snapping pictures right away, muttering about how unnatural everything looked. "You think someone did this?" he asked me after a while. I shook my head. No tracks, no tools, just trees. Later that day, a couple of backpackers came into the station with wild stories about trees that breathed and moved when they weren't looking. They were young kids, probably high on something, so nobody took them seriously except me. Something about their fear felt real. That night, I couldn't sleep. When I stepped outside my cabin for some air, I found pine cones and leaves arranged in strange symbols on my porch. They weren't random, they were deliberate. like someone had left me a message. But who? And why? The next morning, Tommy showed me something that made my skin crawl. He developed some of the photos he took in the grove, and in every single one of them were shapes, humanoid figures, hidden among the trees. They weren't there when we were standing in the grove, we would have seen them, but they were clear as day in his pictures. Maybe it's just shadows playing tricks, Tommy said nervously, but I knew better. Things got worse after that. A wildlife camera we'd set up near the grove captured footage of something I can only describe as impossible. A deer grazing peacefully one moment and then being swallowed by roots that shot out of the ground like snakes. The poor thing didn't even have time to run. It just disappeared into the earth. I showed the footage to Dr. Fiona Holbrook, a botanist studying accelerated growth patterns in the park's redwoods. She didn't say much at first, just stared at the screen with wide eyes. "This isn't normal," she finally whispered. "No kidding," I said. She took soil samples from the grove and promised to analyze them back at her research station. A few days later, Calvin Tucker showed up at the ranger station unannounced. Calvin's an old-timer, a retired logger who worked these woods decades ago when logging companies still had free rein. He looked pale and jittery, like he hadn't slept in days. "You've been poking around where you shouldn't," he said, without so much as a hello. "What are you talking about?" I asked him. "That grove," he said quietly, glancing over his shoulder like someone might be listening. "We called it the planting ground. Cut down a tree there once, biggest one I'd ever seen, and things haven't been right since." "What do you mean not right?" Tommy asked. Calvin hesitated before answering. "Men went crazy out there, hearing voices, seeing things that weren't there. Some never came back." I didn't know what to say to that. It sounded insane, but so did everything else happening around here. That night, as I sat alone in my cabin staring at those strange symbols outside my door, I couldn't shake Calvin's words. Some never came back. Something was wrong with this forest, something deep and ancient, and it wasn't going to stay hidden much longer. The next morning started like any other, but I had a knot in my stomach that wouldn't go away. Something about Calvin's warning stuck with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were dealing with something bigger than just strange trees. When I walked into the ranger station, I found Tommy already there, staring at the photos he'd taken in the grove. "Bobby, look at this," he said, his voice low. He handed me a new set of photos he'd developed overnight. I froze. The figures in the trees were clearer now, almost human-like but distorted. Their limbs were too long, their faces stretched and twisted like they were screaming. "You think someone's messing with us?" Tommy asked, but I could hear the fear in his voice. "No," I said firmly. "This isn't someone playing games." Just as we were trying to make sense of it all, a call came in from a family camping near the grove. They hadn't seen their teenage son since early that morning. We organized a search party right away, me, Tommy, and 2 other rangers, and headed out to their campsite. When we got there, the place was a mess. The tents looked wrong. It was like they had grown into the ground, their fabric fused with roots and vines that weren't there before. The family's gear was half dissolved, covered in moss and fungus that seemed to be spreading fast. We followed a trail of footprints leading away from the site, but halfway through they changed. Human footprints turned into root-like impressions that dug deep into the soil. "What the hell is this?" one of the rangers muttered. I didn't have an answer. As we moved deeper into the forest, Tommy started acting strange. He kept stopping to take pictures of specific trees, mumbling to himself about how beautiful they were. "Tommy?" I said sharply. "We don't have time for this." He looked at me like he didn't recognize me for a second, and then nodded. Yeah, sorry," but he didn't stop taking pictures. We found the boy, or what was left of him, near a massive redwood at the edge of the grove. He was partially merged with the tree trunk, his arms stretched out like branches, and his face barely visible through layers of bark. He was still alive. His eyes moved toward us when we approached, but he couldn't speak or move. One of the rangers tried to pull him free, but his body wasn't just stuck, it was part of the tree now. The bark tore like skin when we tried to move him, and he let out a sound that wasn't human anymore. A deep groan that echoed through the forest like it came from every tree around us. "We can't help him," I said finally, my voice shaking. The others looked at me like I'd lost my mind, but I knew it was true. That night back at my cabin, I couldn't sleep again. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that boy's face staring at me from inside the tree. Around midnight, Tommy knocked on my door. "You awake?" he asked quietly. "Yeah," I said, letting him in. He looked pale and jittery, like Calvin had when he showed up at the station. "I've been losing time," he admitted after a long pause. "What do you mean?" I asked. "Out there in the grove, sometimes I'll be taking pictures, and then suddenly it's hours later and I don't remember anything." He rubbed his arms nervously, and that's when I noticed it. The skin on his forearms was rough and cracked like bark. "What's going on with your arms?" I asked him. "It's just eczema," he said quickly, pulling his sleeves down. But I didn't believe him. The next day, Dr. Holbrook called me from her research station with news about her soil samples. "Bobby," she said urgently, "I found something unusual." "What kind of unusual?" I asked. "The fungal network connecting these trees. It's not just alive, it's intelligent." She paused for a moment before continuing. "And it's spreading faster than anything I've ever seen." I drove out to her station right away to see her findings for myself. She showed me slides under her microscope, tiny threads of fungus weaving through soil and roots like veins in a body. "This isn't natural," she said quietly. "It's evolving." That afternoon, Calvin showed up again at the station looking worse than before. He sat down heavily in one of our chairs and stared at the floor for a long time before speaking. "We woke something up," he said finally. "What do you mean?" Tommy asked him. "In 46, we cut down this massive tree, the biggest one anyone had ever seen, and underneath it was something else." He swallowed hard before continuing. "A burial grove full of warnings carved into stone, warnings in languages nobody could read. And you ignored them?" I asked angrily. "We didn't know," he snapped back. "We thought it was just superstition." "But it wasn't," Tommy said quietly. "No," Calvin admitted. "It wasn't." That evening, as I walked back to my cabin alone, I felt like every tree in the forest was watching me. The air was thick with fog that clung to specific trees like they were hiding something beneath their bark. When I reached my porch, there were more symbols waiting for me. Pine cones and leaves arranged in intricate patterns that seemed almost alive under the moonlight. I didn't sleep that night either. The next morning brought more bad news. A second camper had gone missing near the grove, and this time there were no footprints to follow at all. It was like they'd vanished into thin air or into the trees themselves. Tommy volunteered to lead another search party despite how sick he looked. His skin was getting worse, rough patches spreading across his arms and neck, but he insisted he was fine. I didn't believe him. But what choice did we have? As we headed deeper into the forest again, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, not by people, but by something older and far more dangerous than anything we could understand. And whatever it wasn't done with us yet. The forest felt different that day. It wasn't just the silence or the strange patterns in the trees. It was something deeper, something alive. Every step I took felt like I was walking on a living thing, like the ground itself was breathing beneath my boots. Tommy was ahead of me, his camera swinging from his neck as usual. He kept stopping to take pictures of trees, but he didn't say much. His skin looked worse. More of those bark-like patches had spread across his arms and neck. I wanted to say something, but I didn't know how to bring it up without making things worse. "Tommy," I finally said, breaking the silence. "You sure you're okay?" He turned to me with a tired smile. "I'm fine, Bobby. Just tired." But he wasn't fine. I could see it in his eyes. We were following a dried-up riverbed when we found it, a massive root system stretching across the ground like a giant spiderweb. The roots were thick and twisted, some as wide as tree trunks. They formed a dam-like structure that blocked what used to be the river's path. "What is this?" one of the other rangers asked, his voice shaky. I didn't have an answer. The roots looked like they'd been growing for centuries, but that didn't make sense. This drought had only started a few years ago. Tommy crouched down to take a closer look, running his fingers along one of the roots. "It's hollow," he said quietly, like it's carrying something. Carrying what? I asked. He didn't answer. As we moved further into the grove, things got stranger. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches twisting together overhead to block out the sun. The air grew colder, and the fog thickened until we could barely see a few feet ahead. Then we heard it, a faint whispering sound coming from all around us. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but there was no wind. The air was completely still. "Do you hear that?" one of the rangers whispered. We all nodded. The whispers grew louder as we walked, like voices speaking in a language none of us could understand. It felt like they were coming from inside the trees themselves. We found Dr. Holbrook's research station, abandoned later that afternoon. Her equipment was still there, but it was covered in vines that had grown so fast they'd crushed some of her machines under their weight. Her notes were scattered across the floor, but most of them were unreadable, soaked through with water, or torn apart by roots that had pushed their way inside. "Where is she?" Tommy asked quietly. I didn't answer because I didn't know. That night at my cabin, I sat alone with Dr. Holbrook's journal, the only thing we'd managed to salvage from her station. Her handwriting was shaky toward the end, like she'd been writing in a hurry or under duress. She talked about discovering a collective consciousness in the fungal network beneath the grove, a living thing that connected every tree for miles around. She called it the entity. According to her notes, it wasn't just alive, it was aware. Her last entry sent chills down my spine. The entity is evolving faster than we can study it. It's learning from us, using us. The next day, Tommy disappeared during his night patrol shift. He'd gone out alone despite my protests. I told him he wasn't well enough to be wandering through the forest at night, but he wouldn't listen. We found his radio near one of the larger redwoods in the grove. It was still on, but all we could hear through it was rhythmic breathing, slow and steady like someone sleeping. "Tommy." I shouted into the trees until my voice was hoarse, but there was no response. The search party came across a clearing later that afternoon. A massive open space where the trees formed perfect concentric circles around a central altar-like structure made entirely of roots and vines. The altar pulsed faintly, almost like it had a heartbeat. "What is this place?" one of the rangers whispered. I didn't answer because I didn't know, but deep down I felt like we weren't supposed to be there. As we approached the altar, I saw something carved into one of the nearby trees, symbols similar to those that had appeared outside my cabin but larger and more intricate. They seemed to glow faintly in the dim light filtering through the canopy above. When I touched one of them out of curiosity, everything changed. It was like being hit by lightning, but instead of pain, I felt knowledge pouring into me all at once. Images flashed through my mind, centuries of forest history unfolding in seconds, ancient tribes performing rituals around these same trees, loggers cutting down massive redwoods and awakening something buried beneath them, people disappearing into the forest, never to be seen again. And then I saw myself standing in this very clearing with Tommy beside me, but he wasn't human anymore. His body had become part of the forest, his skin fused with bark, and his eyes glowing faintly like embers in the dark. I pulled my hand away from the symbol and stumbled back, gasping for air as reality snapped back into focus around me. "What happened?" one of the rangers asked nervously. "Nothing," I lied, but my hands were shaking too much for them to believe me. That night back at my cabin, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen, or what it meant for Tommy, for all of us. Whatever this entity was, it wasn't just protecting its forest anymore, it was fighting back against anyone who threatened it, and we were next on its list. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Tommy's face, his skin turning to bark, his eyes glowing like the trees in the grove. I knew I had to find him, but I also knew that whatever had taken him wasn't going to let him go. The next morning, I packed my gear and headed back into the forest alone. The other rangers wanted to come with me, but I told them no. This wasn't their fight, it was mine. I followed the trail deeper into the grove than I'd ever gone before. The trees seemed taller here, their trunks thicker and their roots stretching out like claws across the ground. The air was heavy with fog, and the whispers were louder now, like voices calling my name from inside the trees. After hours of searching, I found him. Tommy was inside a massive hollow redwood, his body fused with the tree's bark. His arms were stretched out like branches, and roots were growing through his chest and legs. He looked like he was part of the tree now, but he was still alive. "Tommy," I whispered, stepping closer. His eyes opened slowly, glowing faintly in the dim light. "Bobby," he said, his voice weak but clear. "What happened to you?" I asked. "It's not what you think," he said quietly. "It's not evil, it's trying to protect itself." "Protect itself from what?" I asked. "From us," he said simply. He told me everything. The entity wasn't just a part of the forest, it was the forest. It had been here for centuries, absorbing people who wandered too close so it could learn from them, understand their thoughts, their fears, their plans. It wasn't killing them, it was using them to evolve, to defend itself against threats like logging and drought and fire. "It's not just a forest anymore," Tommy said. "It's something more." I stared at him, trying to make sense of what he was saying. "And you're okay with this?" I asked. He nodded slowly. "It's not as bad as it looks, but it was bad." He was in pain. I could see it in his eyes. "I can't leave," Tommy said, after a long silence. "I'm part of this now." "No," I said firmly. "You don't have to stay here." He shook his head sadly. "It's too late for me." I didn't want to believe him, but deep down I knew he was right. As we talked, the entity began to communicate through Tommy. His voice changed slightly, becoming deeper and more rhythmic like the whispers in the trees. "You shouldn't be here," it said through him. "I'm not leaving without my friend," I replied. "He is no longer your friend," it said simply. "That's not your choice to make," I snapped back. The entity didn't respond, but the ground beneath me began to shift as roots moved purposefully toward me. I pulled out my service revolver, not because I thought it would help, but because it made me feel less helpless, and aimed it at the tree holding Tommy. "Let him go," I demanded. "He cannot leave," the entity replied through Tommy. "Then end his suffering," I said quietly. Tommy looked at me with tears in his glowing eyes and nodded faintly. "Do it." I hesitated for what felt like an eternity before pulling the trigger. The sound echoed through the grove like thunder, and then everything went silent. The roots stopped moving, and Tommy's body slumped forward slightly as his glowing eyes dimmed and went dark. The tree holding him seemed to sigh, a deep groan that echoed through the grove, and then its bark began to crack and crumble away. I stood there for a long time staring at what was left of my friend before turning and walking away. When I returned to the ranger station later that night, Calvin Tucker was waiting for me with more bad news. The logging company had sent a team into the grove despite our warnings, and they'd uncovered something horrifying. A mass grave filled with human tree hybrids from previous decades. "They're going to burn it all down," Calvin said quietly. "No," I replied firmly. "That'll only make things worse." But nobody listened. Not Calvin, not Ranger Director Miller, not anyone else on the team. They were too scared to think clearly. The next morning, Miller led a team of loggers into the grove armed with chainsaws and flamethrowers. They started cutting down trees indiscriminately, ignoring every warning we'd given them. And that's when the entity fought back. Roots shot out of the ground like spears, impaling some of the loggers before they could react. Branches moved like arms, smashing equipment, and pulling men into the trees where their screams were quickly silenced. It was chaos, pure chaos, and there was nothing we could do to stop it. Miller tried to run but got caught in a tangle of animated roots that wrapped around his legs and dragged him into one of the larger redwoods near the center of the grove. His screams echoed through the forest for what felt like hours before fading into silence. By then, most of the logging team was either dead or missing, and those of us who survived were trapped in a maze of rapidly growing trees that seemed to shift and change every time we turned around. I knew there was only one way out: fire. But starting one would mean violating everything I stood for as a ranger. My job was to protect this forest, not destroy it. But there wasn't any other option left. Using what little fuel we had left from our patrol vehicles, I started a controlled burn near the edge of the grove, just enough to create an escape corridor for those who were still alive. As flames spread through the trees behind us, releasing thick clouds of psychoactive spores into the air, I led what remained of our team out of that nightmare one step at a time until we finally reached safety on higher ground outside its reach. But even then, I knew it wasn't really over yet. Even after we escaped the grove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching us. The fire burned through the night, casting an eerie glow across the park. It wasn't just the trees that burned. It was something deeper, something alive. The entity wasn't gone, but it was weakened, fragmented. The survivors, what few of us were left, were silent as we sat around the ranger station trying to process what had happened. Calvin Tucker didn't say a word. He just stared at the ground, his hands trembling. The others avoided looking at me, like they blamed me for what we'd done. Maybe they were right. The next morning, I went back to the grove alone. The fire had destroyed most of it, but there were still pockets of untouched trees standing tall and silent amidst the ashes. The air smelled of smoke, and something else, something sweet and sickly, like decay. I found the central node, the massive tree with faces embedded in its bark, still standing despite the fire. Its surface was charred, but the faces were still visible, their eyes closed as if they were sleeping. I walked up to it slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what I expected to find. Maybe answers, maybe closure, but all I felt was dread. When I touched the tree's bark, I felt a sharp pain in my hand and pulled back to see tiny roots crawling across my skin like veins. They disappeared almost instantly, but I knew they were inside me now, part of me. I stumbled back from the tree and fell to my knees, gasping for air as visions flooded my mind again. Images of people disappearing into the forest over centuries, their bodies merging with trees, their memories becoming part of the entity's consciousness. And then I saw myself, not as I was now, but as I would be years from now, with bark-like growth spreading across my back and arms, my eyes glowing faintly like Tommy's had before he died. I left the grove after that, and never went back. The Park Service closed off that section of Redwood National Park permanently, calling it a danger zone due to fire damage and unstable terrain. But I knew better. It wasn't just dangerous, it was alive. Years passed, and I retired from being a ranger. My Parkinson's disease got worse over time, but that wasn't what kept me up at night. It was the memories, the faces in the trees, Tommy's glowing eyes, Miller's screams echoing through the forest, and then there were the changes in me. It started small, a rough patch of skin on my back that wouldn't heal, no matter how many creams or ointments I used. Then came the dreams, visions of the grove growing back stronger than ever, trees forming new patterns, whispers calling my name. One day, while sitting on my porch overlooking what remained of Redwood National Park, I noticed something strange in the burned section of forest below. The trees were growing back faster than they should have been, taller and thicker than before, and in their branches was a pattern, a face. It wasn't just any face, it was mine. I stared at it for a long time, unable to move or speak. The entity hadn't forgotten me. It had marked me as part of its forest forever. I don't know how much time I have left before I become like Tommy, before the bark spreads across my body completely, and I lose myself to whatever this thing is. But one thing is certain, the entity isn't gone. It's just waiting for its chance to grow again. And when it does, I'll be part of it. My name is Miguel Vasquez, and I've spent most of my life navigating the wildest, most dangerous places in the Southwest. I'm a search and rescue specialist, or at least I used to be. These days, I try to avoid the canyons. They're beautiful, sure, but they're also full of secrets that don't want to be found. It was the summer of 1983, during a heat wave so brutal that even the lizards were hiding in the shade. That's when I got a call from an old colleague asking me to guide a research team into a restricted part of Canyonlands National Park. I didn't want to go, Something about the place felt wrong, even before I set foot there. But they offered good money, and after being suspended for a year, I figured it was time to get back to work. The team consisted of 4 people: Dr. Diane Foster, an anthropologist with a sharp tongue and an obsession with ancient petroglyphs; Anthony Williams, her quiet graduate student who seemed more comfortable with books than people; Professor James Harrington, an archaeologist who had a habit of keeping secrets; and Ranger Kyle Peterson, who was new to the area and didn't care much for local customs or warnings. From the moment we arrived at the canyon, I felt uneasy. The sandstone formations towered over us like silent giants, their shadows stretching across the ground in strange patterns. The air was thick with dust from the recent storms, making it hard to breathe or see too far ahead. As we hiked deeper into the restricted section, we found petroglyphs carved into the rock, ancient symbols that seemed to tell stories about shapeshifters and rituals. Williams translated some of them for us, but Dr. Foster dismissed his warnings about curses and danger. She was determined to keep going, no matter what we found. One evening, as we set up camp near a newly uncovered rock formation that looked like an altar, things started getting strange. The wind picked up suddenly, carrying whispers that seemed to come from all directions. When we woke up the next morning, our equipment had been rearranged into patterns none of us recognized, circles and lines that reminded me of Navajo stories my grandfather used to tell about forbidden places. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been here before, not physically, but in my nightmares. Since childhood, I dreamed of being hunted through canyons just like these by something I could never quite see. Now those dreams felt closer than ever. The locals had warned us not to enter this canyon after an earthquake shifted the land months ago. They said boundaries had been broken, boundaries that should never be crossed. But Ranger Peterson laughed off their warnings and even took a small artifact from one of the sites despite my protests. That night, as we sat around the campfire trying to make sense of everything we'd seen so far, we heard something that froze us in place, our own voices echoing back from deeper in the canyon. Perfect mimicry of conversations we'd had earlier that day, but there was no one else out there. I didn't sleep that night. None of us did. The next morning, Peterson was gone. His sleeping bag was empty, and his boots were still by the fire. It was like he'd just vanished into thin air. We searched the area, calling his name, but the only thing we found was his ranger hat. It was sitting on a flat rock, filled with sand. The sand wasn't random, it was carefully arranged by color, from light to dark, like someone had taken their time to create it. Foster insisted we keep looking for him, but I could tell she wasn't as worried about Peterson as she was about her research. She kept glancing at the petroglyphs and muttering to herself about migration patterns and rituals. Williams, on the other hand, looked pale as a ghost. He'd been translating more of the symbols and had found something that clearly scared him. "They talk about creatures," he said quietly as we walked. "Things that can steal your shadow before they steal your skin." I didn't say anything, but my stomach dropped. My grandfather used to tell stories like that about skinwalkers, shapeshifters bound to sacred lands. I'd always thought they were just stories meant to keep kids from wandering too far into the desert. But now, I wasn't so sure. By midday, we found Peterson, or at least what was left of him. He was sitting against a rock wall, staring straight ahead with empty eyes. His skin looked wrong, stretched too tight over his bones, like it didn't quite fit anymore. He didn't respond when we called his name, or shook his shoulder. It was like he wasn't really there. We carried him back to camp, but there wasn't much we could do for him. Williams kept glancing at Peterson like he expected him to suddenly move or speak, but Dr. Foster brushed it off as dehydration or heat stroke. "We'll get him out of here tomorrow," she said firmly. That night, things got worse. It started with the cameras. Williams had set up a few around the camp to document our work, but when he checked them after dinner, the footage didn't make sense. There were clips of us walking in places we'd never been, standing in front of petroglyphs we hadn't seen yet. And then there were moments where one of us would look directly into the camera with a blank expression before disappearing from view. "I didn't go there," Williams whispered, staring at the screen. "That's not me, Doctor." Foster dismissed it as a glitch in the equipment, but I could see how tightly she was gripping her notebook. She wasn't as calm as she pretended to be. Later that night, as I lay awake in my tent, I heard footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, circling the camp. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out into the cool desert air, but there was no one there. The canyon walls loomed around us like silent sentinels, their shadows twisting in the moonlight, and then I saw it, someone standing on the canyon rim above us. At first, I thought it was Peterson, but when I shined my flashlight up there, my heart stopped. It wasn't Peterson, it was me. The figure stood perfectly still, staring down at me with an expressionless face. It looked exactly like me, same clothes, same build, but something was off. Its movements weren't natural, they were too smooth, too fluid, like it wasn't used to having a human body. I blinked, and it was gone. The next morning, Williams showed me his journal. There were pages written in his handwriting that he swore he hadn't written, pages filled with strange symbols and warnings about shadows that walk. Foster ignored him and focused on a particular petroglyph that seemed to show a transformation ritual. She became obsessed with it, tracing her fingers over the carvings again and again. Meanwhile, Peterson sat motionless by the fire, his skin looking worse by the hour. By now, even Harrington seemed uneasy. He finally admitted that he'd been to sites like this before and that people had disappeared after taking artifacts or disturbing sacred ground. "We shouldn't be here," he said quietly, as we packed up camp to move deeper into the canyon. "There are things in these places older than we can imagine." For once, I agreed with him. By the time we moved deeper into the canyon, the air felt heavier, like it was pressing down on us. Even the wind had stopped. It was eerily quiet, except for the occasional sound of rocks shifting in the distance. Every step felt like we were being watched, but no one said it out loud. We didn't have to. Williams was getting worse. He kept glancing over his shoulder and muttering to himself, clutching his notebook like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. Peterson hadn't said a word since we found him, but his breathing had become shallow and raspy, like something inside him was struggling to stay alive or trying to get out. Dr. Foster pushed us forward, her focus entirely on the petroglyphs. She found a chamber carved into the rock, its walls covered in symbols that seemed to pulse in the dim light. At the center of the chamber was a floor covered in footprints, hundreds of them, all different sizes and shapes. But as we stood there, staring at them, something strange happened. The footprints started to change. I blinked, thinking it was a trick of the light, but it wasn't. The prints shifted and morphed until they matched our own perfect replicas of our boots and shoes. I stepped back instinctively, my heart pounding in my chest. "We're not alone," Williams whispered. That night, Williams disappeared. We woke up to find his tent empty and his journal lying open by the fire. The pages were filled with frantic scribbles, warnings about shadows and faces that weren't real. We searched for him all morning, calling his name and checking every crevice and ridge in the canyon. We found him miles away from camp, lying on his back near an ancient altar carved into the rock. His skin was flayed in long strips, exposing muscle and bone beneath, but somehow he was still alive. His eyes darted around wildly as he gasped for air. "It's learning to be us," he rasped before collapsing completely. Foster wanted to keep moving forward, despite everything that had happened. She was convinced she was close to uncovering something groundbreaking, something that would change how we understood ancient civilizations forever. But Harrington wasn't so sure anymore. He pulled me aside as we packed up camp and admitted he'd been collecting artifacts from sites like this for years, artifacts that were rumored to be cursed. "I didn't believe it at first," he said quietly. "But now, I think I made a mistake." That evening, as we tried to regroup after losing Williams, our radios started picking up strange transmissions, our own voices discussing plans we hadn't made yet. "Tomorrow, we'll head north." My voice said clearly through the static, "We'll split up to cover more ground." But I hadn't said those words. None of us had. As night fell, I saw it again, the figure that looked exactly like me standing on the canyon rim. This time, it didn't disappear. When I shined my flashlight at it, it just stood there staring down at me with an empty expression. And then it moved. Its movements were wrong, too smooth, too fast, as it climbed down from the rim without using its hands or feet. It flowed like water over the rocks until it disappeared into the shadows below. When I turned back toward camp, I saw Harrington sitting by the fire, but something about him wasn't right. His posture was too stiff, his head tilted slightly to one side as if he were listening to something none of us could hear. And then he spoke, but it wasn't his voice. "You shouldn't have come here," he said slowly, his words distorted like they were coming from underwater. I froze as Harrington's body twisted unnaturally, his joints bending in ways they shouldn't have been able to bend. And then he smiled, a wide, unnatural grin that stretched across his face like a mask. The skinwalker had taken him. Harrington was gone, or maybe it was better to say he wasn't Harrington anymore. Whatever had taken him was wearing his face, but it wasn't him. The way it moved, the way it spoke, it felt wrong, like watching a puppet controlled by invisible strings. "Doctor." Foster tried to talk to him, but he didn't respond. He just sat there, staring at the fire with that twisted smile. I wanted to leave, but Foster insisted we stay. She said we couldn't abandon Harrington, even though it was clear he wasn't coming back. That night, I dreamed of the canyon again. The same nightmare I'd had since I was a kid. I was running through the sandstone labyrinth, my feet slipping on loose rocks as something chased me. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it getting closer with every step. When I woke up, my heart was pounding, and my hands were shaking. I wasn't the only one who felt it. Foster looked pale and exhausted, like she hadn't slept at all. Peterson hadn't moved from his spot by the fire, and his breathing had grown weaker. It was like the canyon itself was draining the life out of us. As we packed up camp to move deeper into the maze-like canyon system, Foster discovered something that stopped her in her tracks, a chamber carved into the rock with symbols covering every surface. At the center of the chamber was a pool of water so still it looked like glass. Foster knelt by the edge and stared into her reflection. But when I looked over her shoulder, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Her reflection wasn't hers. It looked like her at first glance, but then I noticed the subtle differences. The eyes were too wide, the smile too sharp. It was watching her with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Don't touch it," I said quickly, pulling her back from the edge. She snapped out of whatever trance she'd been in and shook her head like she was trying to clear her thoughts. "It's just water," she muttered, but I could tell she didn't believe her own words. As we moved deeper into the canyon, things got worse. The walls seemed to shift around us, creating new paths where there hadn't been any before. The echoes of our footsteps sounded wrong, too loud, too close, and sometimes they didn't match our movements at all. At one point, Foster stopped suddenly and pointed ahead. "There's someone up there," she whispered. I followed her gaze and saw a figure standing in the distance. It looked like Williams, his clothes, his posture. But when I called his name, he didn't respond. Instead, he turned slowly to face us, and my stomach dropped. It wasn't Williams. Its face was blank, smooth skin stretched over bone with no features at all. And then it started walking toward us with slow, deliberate steps. "Run," I said quietly, grabbing Foster's arm and pulling her back down the path. We ran blindly through the canyon until we couldn't hear its footsteps anymore. When we finally stopped to catch our breath, Foster turned to me with tears in her eyes. "I think it's trying to become us," she said softly. As night fell again, Foster discovered another chamber deep within the canyon, a room filled with carvings that seemed to tell a story about an ancient prison built to contain something powerful. She traced her fingers over the symbols and muttered under her breath about earthquakes breaking boundaries and rituals being forgotten. I remembered what my grandfather had told me when I was a kid, stories about people who had abandoned their gods and paid the price for their arrogance. He'd always warned me never to go near places like this because they were cursed by those who came before us. Foster became obsessed with finding a way to stop whatever was hunting us. She believed the petroglyphs held the answer, a ritual that could bind the entity back to its prison, but she wasn't sure how to perform it. That night, as we sat around what remained of our campfire, Peterson finally spoke for the first time since we'd found him. "It's wearing faces," he whispered hoarsely before collapsing completely. Peterson's words echoed in my mind long after he collapsed. "It's wearing faces." I didn't know if he was warning us or if it was just the last thing his broken mind could hold on to. Either way, it chilled me to the core. Foster and I were the only ones left who could still think clearly, if you could call it that. Harrington was gone. Peterson was barely clinging to life, and Williams, well, I didn't want to think about what had happened to him. Foster was convinced the answer lay in the petroglyphs, but I wasn't sure we had enough time to figure it out. The canyon felt alive now, like it was breathing around us. The walls seemed closer than before, and every shadow felt like it was watching. As we moved through the narrow paths, I kept seeing glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, figures that disappeared when I turned to look at them. Then I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. It was Foster, standing ahead of me on the path. But Foster was also right next to me, clutching her notebook tightly. The figure ahead of us turned slowly, and I realized it wasn't her. It just looked like her. Its face was too smooth, its smile too wide. It tilted its head at an unnatural angle before stepping back into the shadows. Foster grabbed my arm. "We have to finish this," she said urgently. "Whatever this thing is, it's getting stronger." We finally reached the chamber she'd been looking for, the one with the massive petroglyph map carved into the walls. Foster ran her fingers over the symbols, muttering to herself as she pieced together fragments of the ritual. "It needs blood," she said finally, her voice trembling, and words, prayers, oaths, stared at her. "What kind of prayers?" "Navajo prayers," she said quietly, looking at me with a mixture of desperation and hope. "You know them, don't you?" I did. My grandfather had taught me when I was a boy, though I hadn't spoken them in years. But before I could respond, we heard something behind us, a low, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. It was Harrington, or what used to be Harrington, standing in the doorway of the chamber. His body moved like a marionette, his limbs jerking unnaturally as he stepped closer. Foster shoved her notebook into my hands. "Go," she shouted. "I'll distract it." "No." I grabbed her arm, but she pulled away. "There's no time," she yelled, tears streaming down her face. "You have to finish this." Before I could stop her, she ran toward Harrington, or the thing wearing his face, screaming at it to follow her. It worked. The creature turned and lunged after her, leaving me alone in the chamber. I didn't want to leave her behind, but I knew she was right. If we didn't stop this thing now, none of us would make it out alive. I turned back to the petroglyphs and started reciting the prayers my grandfather had taught me. My voice shook at first, but as I kept going, something shifted in the air around me. The walls seemed to hum with energy, and the symbols on the rock began to glow faintly. The ground beneath me trembled as a deep rumble echoed through the canyon, a localized earthquake that felt like it was coming from inside the chamber itself. A crack appeared in the floor, revealing a deeper chamber below, and then it appeared. The skinwalker stepped into the light of the chamber, cycling through forms faster than my eyes could follow. Foster, Harrington, Peterson, Williams, even me. It moved closer with impossible fluidity, its face shifting constantly, as if trying to decide which one would scare me most. "You can't stop me," it said in a voice that sounded like all of us speaking at once. "Let me go, and I'll give you everything you've ever wanted." I ignored it, and kept reciting the prayers louder this time as I cut my palm with a sharp rock and let my blood drip onto the altar at the center of the chamber. The skinwalker screamed, a sound so piercing and unnatural that it felt like needles stabbing into my ears. It lunged toward me just as I finished the last words of the prayer. There was a blinding flash of light as the canyon shook violently one last time. When I opened my eyes again, everything was still. The skinwalker was gone. When they found me hours later, I couldn't speak. Not because I didn't want to, but because something inside me wouldn't let me explain what had happened. They wrote it off as hallucinations caused by toxic gas pockets in the canyon, an easy explanation for something they couldn't understand. But I knew better. Years later, I returned to that canyon alone. The park had put up warning signs around the area after our expedition, a vague attempt to keep people out without explaining why. Before I left, I placed an offering at the edge of the canyon, a small token of respect for whatever still lingered there. As I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in a shallow pool of water nearby. For just a moment, it wasn't my face looking back at me. My name is Derek Marshall. I've been a ranger at Mount Rainier National Park for over 20 years. I've seen avalanches, blizzards, and even the occasional bear attack. But nothing prepared me for what happened in the fall of 1994. It started with the fog, thick, heavy, and unnatural. It rolled in one morning and didn't leave. The weather reports called it a temperature inversion, but I knew better. I'd spent my life on these mountains. I could read the wind, the clouds, the way the air smelled before a storm. This fog wasn't normal. It clung to the ground like it was alive, twisting and curling around trees and rocks, swallowing everything in its path. The first sign of trouble came when a group of hikers went missing. A family of 4, 2 parents and their teenage kids, had taken one of the lesser-used northern trails. They were experienced hikers, well prepared for the cold, but they never came back. We found their car in the parking lot, frost covering the windows despite the unseasonable warmth. I led the search party myself. We combed through the woods for hours, calling their names, but all we found were torn backpacks hanging from tree branches like some kind of sick trophy. No footprints, no blood, nothing to explain what had happened to them. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my desk with my father's old ice axe resting against my leg, a habit I'd picked up after losing my wife 2 years earlier in an avalanche. I should have predicted. The guilt still weighed on me, and lately it had started creeping into my dreams. But this wasn't about her. This was something else. I flipped through my journal, where I kept notes on anything unusual in the park, strange tracks, unexplained noises, odd weather patterns. Over the past few weeks, there had been more entries than usual. Howling that didn't match any known animal, sudden drops in temperature, and now this fog. The next morning, Lydia Oakes arrived at the ranger station. She was a biologist specializing in predators and had come to investigate reports of prey animals fleeing higher elevations en masse. Something's spooking them, she said, as she unpacked her gear in the station's small lab. Deer don't just abandon their territory without a reason. Peter Holloway, a rookie ranger barely out of training, was eager to help her set up cameras along the trails. He had a knack for photography and carried his camera everywhere he went. Maybe we'll catch Bigfoot, he joked as he loaded his pack. I didn't laugh. Later that day, Dr. Martin Reynolds joined us. He was a meteorologist, studying the fog itself, why it wasn't dissipating, and why it seemed to interfere with electronic equipment, like radios and GPS devices. He showed me samples he'd collected from condensation on tree leaves. There's something organic in this fog, he said, frowning at his microscope. That evening, as we prepared for another search mission, an elder from a nearby tribal community stopped by the station unannounced. His name was Samuel Greycloud, and he'd lived near these mountains his entire life. "You need to leave," he said bluntly, his voice low and serious. "Leave?" I asked. "We can just abandon missing hikers. They sit or already gone," he replied. "This mountain, it belongs to those who walk like men when watched." I didn't know what to say to that. He left before I could ask him more. The next day brought more questions than answers. Peter found strange tracks near one of our trail cameras, 5-toed prints that started human-like but transitioned into something canine mid-stride. The camera itself had captured blurry images of tall figures moving faster than any person or animal should be able to. And then there were the voices on the radio. We were setting up camp near one of the higher trails when my handheld crackled to life with distorted sounds, growls mixed with fragmented words in broken English. Help, come, stay. None of us had transmitted anything. That night, as we huddled around a fire trying to make sense of it all, Lydia mentioned something that sent chills down my spine. "There are legends about creatures like this," she said quietly. "Dogmen, half-human, half-wolf beings that can manipulate weather and hunt in packs." I wanted to dismiss her as superstitious nonsense, but deep down I couldn't shake the feeling that she might be right. The final straw came when we stumbled upon a cave entrance exposed by a recent rock slide. The opening was surrounded by ancient wooden totems carved with snarling faces and clawed hands, a warning if ever I'd seen one. As I stared into the dark mouth of that cave, an icy wind blew through the trees behind me, carrying with it a sound that made my blood run cold, howling unlike anything I'd heard before. And that's when I knew we weren't alone on this mountain anymore. The next morning, the fog was thicker than ever. It swallowed everything. Trees, rocks, even sound. You could barely see a few yards ahead, and the silence was unnerving. It felt like the mountain itself was holding its breath. We were preparing to search for another group of hikers who had gone missing. A father and his teenage son had set out on a day trek 2 days ago and hadn't returned. Their car was still parked at the trailhead, just like the last family's. I organized the team carefully. Lydia, Peter, Dr. Reynolds, and myself. Ranger Captain Frank Donovan stayed behind at the station to coordinate from there. He didn't believe anything supernatural was happening. He thought it was just bad weather and wild animals, but I knew better. As we started up the trail, the fog seemed to close in around us. It wasn't just thick, it felt heavy, like it was pressing down on us. The air was colder than it should have been, and every step felt harder than the last. Peter walked ahead with his camera, snapping pictures of anything unusual. Lydia kept stopping to check tracks and signs of animal movement. Dr. Reynolds carried his equipment in a backpack, muttering about how his instruments were acting up again. We hadn't gone far when things started to get strange. First, there were the noises, low growls and distant howls that echoed through the fog. They didn't sound like wolves or coyotes. They were deeper, more guttural, almost human-like. Every time we heard them, we stopped and listened, but they never came closer or farther away. Then came the abandoned campsite. Peter found it first, a cluster of tents shredded from the inside out. Sleeping bags were torn apart, supplies scattered everywhere. Lydia examined the damage and shook her head. "This wasn't set a bear," she said quietly. "Bears don't do this." I bent down to look closer at one of the tents. The fabric was ripped cleanly, as if by claws sharper than any animal I'd ever seen. Dr. Reynolds' voice broke the silence. "Look at this." He pointed to a patch of frost on the ground near one of the tents, perfectly formed ice crystals in a circle about 3 feet wide. "It's not cold enough for this," he said, staring at it in disbelief. We pressed on, but the tension grew with every step. The fog seemed alive now, moving in unnatural patterns against the wind. Sometimes it would swirl around us like it was trying to pull us off the trail. Other times it would part just enough to show glimpses of something moving in the distance. At one point, Peter froze in his tracks and pointed toward the tree line. "Did you see that?" he whispered. I followed his gaze but saw nothing, just shadows shifting in the fog. "What did you see?" I asked him. He hesitated before answering. It looked like me. I didn't know what to say to that. By late afternoon, we reached a clearing where Lydia set up wildlife cameras to monitor movement overnight. As she worked, Dr. Reynolds showed me something on his handheld device, a recording of sound patterns he'd picked up during our hike. "It's organized," he said, playing it back for me. A series of howls that rose and fell in rhythmic patterns like a language. I stared at him in disbelief. "You think they communicating?" He nodded slowly. "Whatever said they are." That night, as we sat around a small fire trying to stay warm, I flipped through an old journal I'd found earlier that day, a leather-bound notebook buried under debris near one of the trails. It belonged to a ranger from the 1930s who had described identical phenomena: fog that didn't behave normally, howling that sounded like speech, missing hikers who were never found. The final entry read, "They come with the fog." I didn't tell anyone about it, not yet. As we settled in for what little sleep we could get, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The fog pressed against our camp like a living thing, and every now and then I thought I saw glowing eyes staring back at me from the darkness. But when I blinked, they were gone. By morning, the fog hadn't lifted. If anything, it was worse. The air felt colder, and the silence was so complete, it made my ears ring. I could tell the others were uneasy. Even Donovan's usual confidence seemed shaken as he radioed us from the station. We decided to investigate the cave we'd found earlier. Something about those ancient warning totems stuck with me. They felt like a message, one we couldn't ignore. The hike to the cave was slow and tense. Every few minutes, someone would stop and look over their shoulder, convinced they'd heard footsteps or seen movement in the fog. I didn't blame them. I felt it too. It wasn't just paranoia. We were being followed. I could feel it in my gut. When we finally reached the cave entrance, the air changed again. It was colder here, and the fog seemed thicker, almost solid. The totems stood like sentinels, their carved faces twisted in expressions of fear and anger. Peter raised his camera and snapped a few pictures before stepping inside. "You guys coming?" he asked, his voice echoing off the stone walls. I hesitated but followed him. Lydia and Dr. Reynolds came next, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The cave was massive, tunnels branching off in every direction like a maze. The walls were covered in claw marks, deep gouges that looked too large for any animal I knew of. And then there were the piles of personal items, backpacks, jackets, even shoes, all scattered across the floor. "These belong to the missing hikers," Lydia said softly, picking up a torn jacket that looked decades old. Dr. Reynolds knelt beside a pile of bones, human bones, half-eaten and arranged in strange patterns. "This isn't sept random," he muttered. "It's seps ritualistic." I didn't want to think about what that meant. As we moved deeper into the cave, the howling started again, low and distant at first, but growing louder with every step. It wasn't just noise anymore. It was speech, fragmented words that echoed around us like whispers. "Leave. Stay. Hunt." Peter froze mid-step and pointed ahead. There sat something moving. I raised my flashlight and saw them, tall figures standing just beyond the beam of light. They were humanoid but wrong, their limbs too long, their movements unnatural. Their glowing eyes reflected back at us like animal eyes caught in headlights. "They stir watching us," Lydia whispered. And then they moved. The creatures rushed forward with terrifying speed, switching from bipedal to quadrupedal as they closed the distance between us. Their howling turned into deafening screams that made my chest tighten with fear. "Run!" I shouted. We bolted back toward the entrance, but the fog had seeped inside now, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The creatures didn't chase us outright. They herded us, forcing us down specific tunnels, like hunters driving prey into a trap. Peter tripped over a rock and fell hard, his camera skidding across the floor. I grabbed his arm and pulled him up just as one of the creatures lunged at him from the shadows. Its elongated jaw snapped inches from his face before retreating into the darkness. When we finally stumbled out of the cave into daylight, or what little daylight there was, the creatures didn't follow us. They stayed inside, their glowing eyes watching from the shadows as if bound by some invisible barrier. We didn't stop running until we reached a clearing far from the cave entrance. Everyone was shaken, Peter especially, but no one spoke for a long time. Finally, Dr. Reynolds broke the silence. "They sept are intelligent," he said quietly. Lydia nodded grimly. "They sept are hunting us." I looked back at the fog-covered trail behind us and realized something else. This wasn't random behavior, it was territorial. We'd disturbed something ancient when that rock slide exposed their den, something that didn't want us here. As night fell again, I sat by our fire with my journal open on my lap, trying to piece everything together, the fog, the howling language, the claw marks in the cave walls. And then it hit me, every disappearance on this mountain had happened under specific conditions. Heavy fog during certain lunar cycles. This wasn't just bad luck or coincidence, it was planned. Night fell fast, and with it came the fog, thicker, colder, and more oppressive than before. It wasn't just around us anymore, it was inside us. Every breath felt heavy, like the air itself was trying to pull us down. The fire we'd built crackled weakly, barely pushing back the darkness. We were trapped. The creatures didn't attack right away. They were patient, circling just out of sight, testing us. Every now and then, we'd hear a low growl or a distorted voice calling from the fog. Sometimes it sounded like one of us. Our own voices echoed back at us in broken fragments. Help, stay, don't leave. Peter clutched his camera like it was a lifeline, snapping pictures every time he thought he saw movement. Lydia sat beside him, staring into the fire with a look I couldn't quite read, fear mixed with determination. Reynolds was quiet, his equipment spread out in front of him as he scribbled notes furiously. And me? I kept my father's ice axe close, gripping it so tightly my knuckles turned white. Then the first attack came. It started with Peter. He'd wandered a few steps away from camp to check one of the wildlife cameras Lydia had set up earlier. I called after him, but he didn't answer. The fog swallowed him whole. Peter, Lydia shouted, running after him. I followed close behind, my flashlight cutting through the mist. We found him standing in front of the camera, staring at something on its screen. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "What is it?" I asked. He turned the camera toward us, showing a video it had captured earlier that evening. Shadowy figures moving through the trees, their glowing eyes fixed on the lens. But what made my stomach drop was the last frame. One of the creatures standing upright and staring directly into the camera, wearing Peter's face. "That's not me," he whispered. Before I could respond, a deafening howl tore through the fog, a sound so loud and guttural it felt like it was vibrating inside my chest. The creatures were close now, circling us like wolves around prey. We ran back to camp as fast as we could, but things only got worse from there. One of them came through the fog, a towering figure with elongated limbs and glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. It moved slowly at first, testing us, before lunging toward Dr. Reynolds with terrifying speed. He didn't scream or run. He just stood there and shouted at us to go while he created a distraction. "Get out of here," he yelled as he swung his backpack at the creature. It worked for a moment. The creature hesitated before grabbing him with clawed hands and dragging him into the fog. His screams echoed for what felt like hours before fading into silence. We didn't have time to grieve. We had to move. Lydia led us toward higher ground where she said we might find defensible terrain, a rocky outcrop near an abandoned fire lookout she'd seen on an old map. But the creatures were relentless, herding us in specific directions like they were playing some kind of sick game. At one point, Donovan Seth's voice crackled over the radio. "Marshall, what's Seth's going on out there?" I grabbed my handheld and shouted back. "We are under attack. Get help." But all I heard in response was static, and then my own voice repeating back to me, "Get help, get help, get help." The creatures weren't just hunting us, they were messing with our minds. By the time we reached the fire lookout, we were exhausted and terrified. The building was old and falling apart, but it was better than nothing. We barricaded ourselves inside as best we could, stacking furniture against doors and windows, while Peter set up his camera to monitor movement outside. The howling grew louder as night deepened. The creatures weren't trying to break in yet. They were testing us, scratching at walls, mimicking voices, even throwing rocks at windows to see how we'd react. And then came the worst part, the voices of people we knew calling from outside. Dr. Reynolds Sip's voice begging for help. Lydia Sip's voice crying, even my wife Sip's voice whispering from somewhere in the fog. "Derek, come find me." I almost lost it then, almost opened the door and walked straight into their trap, but Lydia grabbed my arm and snapped me back to reality. "They spear trying to break you," she said firmly. "Don't let them." I nodded, but didn't trust myself to speak. As dawn approached, Peter showed me something on his camera, a pattern in how the fog moved around us. Every 20 minutes or so, there was a brief window where visibility improved slightly, a chance for escape if we timed it right. "We have to try," I said quietly. "It sets our only shot." The first hint of dawn was barely visible through the fog, a faint gray light that seemed more like a trick than a promise. The creatures were still out there, circling the fire lookout like sharks around a sinking ship. Their howls had grown quieter, but that only made it worse. Silence meant they were planning something. Peter's discovery about the fog's pattern gave us hope. A slim chance to escape during the brief windows of clarity. We didn't have much time to prepare. Lydia and I worked quickly, gathering supplies and mapping out the safest route down the mountain. Peter packed his camera and grabbed a hiking pole to use as a weapon. But deep down, I knew we wouldn't stud all make it. As we waited for the next clearing in the fog, the creatures grew bolder. They started testing the barricades, clawing at the doors and windows, their distorted voices whispering things that made my skin crawl. Run, hide, leave. One of them climbed onto the roof, its footsteps creaking above us. Lydia aimed her flashlight at the ceiling, and for a moment we saw its shadow, a long-limbed figure crouched like an animal ready to pounce. "We can stay here," I said firmly. "It sets now or never." The fog shifted again, thinning just enough for us to see a few yards ahead. It was our chance. We opened the door and ran. The cold hit me like a wall as we stumbled down the trail, our flashlights cutting through what little visibility we had. The creatures followed close behind, their glowing eyes flickering in and out of sight like fireflies in the mist. Peter was ahead of us, his camera swinging from his neck as he sprinted toward safety. Lydia stayed close to me, her breathing heavy but steady. I kept my ice axe ready, knowing it wouldn't do much against these things, but needing something to hold on to, something that felt real. The fog thickened again just as we reached a narrow ridge overlooking a steep drop. The trail was slippery with frost, and one wrong step could send us tumbling into darkness. That sips when they attacked. One of the creatures lunged at Peter from the side, knocking him off balance. He swung his hiking pole wildly, hitting it in the jaw before scrambling back to his feet. Lydia grabbed a rock and threw it at another creature that had crept up behind us, forcing it to retreat into the fog. But there were too many of them. They herded us toward the edge of the ridge, their howls echoing around us like a hunting call. I could feel their claws scraping against my jacket as I swung my axe blindly, trying to keep them at bay. And then I saw it, the river below us, cutting through the valley like a lifeline. It wasn't far, but getting there would mean climbing down a steep slope while these things chased us. "Go," I shouted. "Get to the river." They did follow. Lydia hesitated for a moment before nodding. She grabbed Peter's arm and started down the slope while I stayed behind to hold them off. The creatures surrounded me now, their glowing eyes fixed on mine as they closed in. One of them mimicked my wife's voice again. "Derek, come home." But this time I didn't falter. I swung my axe with everything I had, hitting one of them square in the chest. It let out a scream that sounded almost human before collapsing into the fog. The others hesitated for just a moment, long enough for me to turn and run after Lydia and Peter. By the time I reached the riverbank, my lungs were burning and my legs felt like they might give out. The creatures stopped at the edge of the water, pacing back and forth, but refusing to cross. Lydia and Peter were waiting on the other side, their faces pale but alive. Peter held up his camera triumphantly, a small victory in all this madness. "We did it," he said breathlessly. But I knew better. I handed Lydia my journal, the one where I sipped written everything down, and looked her in the eye. "You have to warn people," I said quietly. "They need to know." "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice trembling. I didn't answer. Instead, I turned back toward the fog-covered mountain where the creatures still waited. This was my home, my responsibility, and I wasn't going to let anyone else die because of me. As I stepped into the fog one last time, I heard Lydia calling after me, but her voice faded quickly as the mist swallowed me whole. Years later, Peter returned to Mount Rainier as a senior ranger with Lydia's help. He kept Marshall's journal safe and built warning systems based on everything they'd learned about the creatures, their patterns, their weaknesses, their hunting cycles. Official reports blamed all those deaths on wildlife attacks or accidents caused by bad weather, but Peter knew better. And every time he saw fog rolling in over those northern trails, he remembered Marshall's sacrifice and prayed it would be enough to keep them at bay.